Noll, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Okay, here we go. We have our first question. Are you ready for the Fast Five?
Well, here we go, ready or not.
Okay. All right, here's a simple one. This is an easy question. How do you like your coffee?
Black with caffeine before noon, without caffeine in the afternoon.
All right. That's a good basic one to get us started. I like that. Number two. Now this one, because you're a historian, what is the one figure from American history that you would love just to sit and have coffee with and pick their brain?
I've been working recently a lot on African-American uses of the Bible, and one of the most interesting people is James W.C. Pennington. He was born enslaved. He escaped, published a book called The Fugitive Blacksmith, became a Presbyterian minister, wrote the first textbook for African Americans on the history of races, eventually pastored in New York City and eventually down south. Was just a terrific person of God, but then also a really extraordinary student of the scriptures. He had to learn to read when he was in his 20s. He was the first person to sit in as a Black student at the Yale Divinity School. He wasn't allowed to take classes formally. And so, I mean, there are other people I've known about and studied for decades, but Pennington, I've read his books and books about him the last 5 or 6, 10 years, and really an interesting guy.
And what years did he live?
Well, this is approximate 1820, 1815 to 1875.
Wow. And when's this book supposed to come out?
Well, the book is out this past year called America's Book, The Rise and Decline of a Bible Civilization, 1794 to 1911. And so Pennington shows up a couple times in the book as a really key figure.
I really want to learn more about this guy. He sounds like a phenomenal man. It didn't learn to read until he was 20.
Well, this is actually one of the fun things about studying, trying to broaden out study of evangelical tradition. Pennington is just as evangelical as the day is long, but he doesn't have the standard Caucasian hermeneutical approach to the scriptures because of learning it and even preaching it while he was still learning to read. And then having the experience of internalizing the scriptures from his own experience and not the experience of, the Reformation and the English settlement of America and what was common in the white world of the time.
Wow, that's it's a character that I wasn't familiar with, but I want to learn more.
Well, I can't blame you, because maybe until 10 years ago, I'm supposed to do this for a living, and I maybe heard of him, but not really done too much study.
Well, there's just so much to study. I mean, you can't study everything.
Right, exactly. That's a humbling realization.
Oh my goodness. Well, let's get to our third question. This one's going to be a little bit different, but if you were a restaurant, what restaurant would you be and why?
We had a lovely little Chinese restaurant here in Wheaton called Fu Yuan's that is now just recently closed. It was where I used to go have lunch with John Wilson when Books and Culture, the editor of Books and Culture, when it was still going strong. And when we moved back to Wheaton after living 10 years in South Bend, Indiana, we were delighted to come back to Fu Yuan's because the service was good, the food was delicious. It was not pretentious, and if you sat over your table for 45 minutes for an extra long conversation, nobody minded. Unfortunately, they've closed, so we're missing that gastronomical as well as cultural highlight of Wheaton, Illinois.
I hate it when my favorite restaurants close. I hate that. Now you got to find something else. It's just the place where you can relax and be yourself.
Right.
Okay, question number 4. One thing that people may not know about you is what?
Well, just how wonderful it is to be a boring historian. People think, going to the library, sitting around reading books all day, what a boring life. Well, it's anything but boring. I've just been delighted day in and day out to have that kind of life.
Have you ever read Anton Chekhov's The Bet? You ever
No,
read that?
no.
In the book, I'm not going to tell you. It's not a book. It's like a short story. That in the book, he has these two men make this bet, and they were talking about life imprisonment or the death penalty. And one says it's better just to be dead rather than be alone. And the other guy says, basically you want to put a bet on that. And so they make this bet. And for years, one of them agrees to be alone and completely by himself, cut off from the world. It's a fascinating story. But at the end of it, I mean, he ends up, I'm not going to give you the ending, but he does say in the story, there's this part where the guy that's locked up, he says, I've been in more places than you could ever imagine. Because he could have any piece of literature. He had to like write it down on a slot and just get these books. But I don't think people realize that. The adventure, it does something different to your mind. It takes you places and into the minds of people. And
I don't think I'd want to be entirely isolated, but a lot of isolation has been pretty good.
Well, I think people like to be quiet and to just reflect. I think that's not a bad thing, especially just to really just get an idea of who we are. But the next question, final question: if you were an era of history, any history, world history, American history, whatever you pick, what era would you be and why?
I remember asking one of my favorite teachers, David Wells, once about a question similar to this, and he said, well, intellectually and even spiritually, there's many places I'd like to be, but if I wasn't living today, I'd be dead, because he'd had a physical condition that had to take him to the hospital and have a procedure that wasn't available even 10 years earlier. So intellectually, it'd be great to be at the table of Martin Luther and hear him spouting off and a mixture of craziness and deep spirituality. It'd be wonderful to know Latin well enough to understand Thomas Aquinas as he's dictating some of the Summa Theologica. Apparently he wore out several people a day dictating these books. It'd be wonderful to hear David George, again, one of the great African-American preachers of the late 18th century, as he encouraged his congregations in Georgia and then Canada and then Sierra Leone to go on with the gospel. So when you're a historian, there's just too many places, too many.
Yeah.
But to stay alive, I kind of would like to live in the present,
Well, let's get into, you talk about the present. Let's get into a bit of your biography, who you are, how you came to faith, and how did you ever become a historian? I know that's a loaded question for a historian, so we're looking for the 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, it is. Historians in general are not too self-reflective, so it's actually maybe a little bit hard question to answer. But I always enjoyed reading historical things. American history first, eventually the history of Christianity. I was an English major in college, did a master's degree in comparative literature, but then decided for intellectual reasons, but then also spiritual reasons, after college, after graduating from Wheaton College, the question of what was real about the world, what was real about faith became urgent in a new way. And I did find through studying the Reformation, studying particularly the life of Martin Luther, and then some of the things around him, that there were answers to intellectual questions, answers to personal questions that I found in that historical era, historical debates, that I had not found in my understanding, my experience of contemporary Christianity. So after having sort of been reading on my own history for all my reading life, and then seeing that how important the understanding of a new angle on the faith provided by studying the 16th century, it just seemed natural to go on. And lo and behold, you could actually in those days make a living as a historian. Things are really rough now for people who are trying to study history, and they weren't great when I studied it, went to graduate school, but at least you could get a job. So I think I became a historian because of the sense that examining what had happened in the past gave me real insight into the nature of humankind, the nature of human cultures, the possibilities of Christian faith. Later, actually quite a bit later, when I got to know a little bit about Christianity around the world, it was the same thing, just super revealing about the character of Christianity, opened up by looking at historical development in places like Canada, Britain, the continent, eventually Africa, Latin America, Asia. So once sort of dipping my toe into the historical stream, it just seemed like I needed to go deeper and take a bath and just stay there. So I'm not sure that's exactly right, because I just don't spend a lot of time thinking about why I'm interested in what I'm interested in. But I think the fact that historical study and historical reading always seems so illuminating helps explain why I'm a historian.
Why, you mentioned that it's hard to make a living as a historian nowadays. Why is that?
The classical liberal arts model, in which the ideal is students who want to study anything, veterinary science, engineering, business, will have an exposure to philosophy, history, literature, the theory of the social sciences, the history of science. That model is under tremendous pressure because of the economic realities of our time, because of how difficult it is for liberal arts colleges and liberal arts emphases in universities to get the funding they need, as opposed to the fields where people are being trained to get that first job right away. I've seen some really discouraging figures, and just recently about the number of historians employed at universities and colleges throughout the Midwest. Almost every place you can look, a reduction from half to a quarter to a third of the people who used to be teaching things. And I think our world in the West is hyper-focused on the present. So the expansion of the internet has been good in some ways. There's certainly more information about more things available. Of course, quality checks are good. Some of the information is just bogus. But for example, working on this book on the Bible in the 19th century, for almost anything that was a book in print, I could bring it up on my computer in 30 seconds. For most of what was in the newspapers and the periodicals, it took a little bit more work, but I could bring it up. And this is just, so I had sitting right here at my computer, a library better than any library in the world around 1960, 1970. So that's a huge benefit. On the other side, however, the internet makes it possible for people to be drawn into what's happening around the world, drawn into what is being contested in their own environment, and the attraction of things that are immediately present and that seem to call for immediate, at least, opinions, if not reaction, is very, very strong. And so I think that hyper focus upon the present has detracted from the understanding that in order to understand the present, we have to have a better grasp of the past. And then when the past does come into play, it's almost always in the popular media a simplified, simplistic, overly reductionistic approach. So I think, for example, that Black Lives Matter and debates over critical race theory have been really important for drawing into the public eye genuine facts of life that had been obscured. But the way in which that focus is sometimes brought to bear is as if nothing else matters. And so the proponents and the opponents end up shouting and getting excited and demonizing their opponents rather than being pushed to examine more carefully and with a fuller understanding the events of the past. In this particular instance, it's just, as a historian, it's just imperative to realize how ever-present considerations of race were in American history. But if I say American history is only the ever-present consideration and difficulties of racial stereotyping, then I've betrayed what actually happened, because the past is broader. But in our media age, it's the extreme positions that gain the attention, that gain funding, that gain the pushback, and that monopolize debate. And as you know, as a conductor of this kind of podcast, if someone wants to say, well, to answer your question, we need to examine 3 background factors, and then to keep in mind this and that, well, you've lost at least some of your audience. But if you say, what's the situation about X, and I'm really firm and vigorous and have a sharply pointed answer, then that's going to carry, and people will be picking that up. And that phenomenon, I think, has undercut the desire for fuller, deeper, richer historical understanding, which is available. We're living in a great age of seriously produced history, but we're also living in a great age of dismissing seriously produced history. Well, that's a long answer for the question, but
no.
I think there's kind of economic factors, but then there's also cultural factors that explain why why becoming a historian as a way of earning your living is becoming more and more difficult.
I think, though, that you've hit really on the nail on the head. Just as we're talking about history, we're talking about evangelicalism, all of these things coalesce, as you've already mentioned. And I just want to give a wholehearted amen, because there's no more nuance. Nuance is not favored in our contemporary culture. It's winners and losers.
Right.
And it's who has the power. And oftentimes, as you've said, history is much more nuanced than that in our understanding of it. And we have a tendency to characterize the past with our current observations. That's one of the things that I'm so frustrated with now when I see all these cultural things that are happening, when people are making judgments on history. Right. You didn't live in that cultural moment. You have no idea. I'm not saying that they were completely right in their assessment, but you have the advantage of being at this cultural moment, being able to even say that. Right. Like, you have the education that allows you to look back on it. But in our own current historical moment, we need to be able to, see the word of God, but also to see history as a warning because of these extremes, but also find an encouragement. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this stuff. But I do want to talk more about the history and what we learned. Actually, you've already talked about it, so excuse me. But let's get into evangelicalism for a moment. And I know this is a loaded question because I've just read this. The book is called, for those that can't see, you're not on our YouTube, you're on our audio. It's simply called Evangelicals: Who They Have Been, Are Now, and Could Be. And the first really part of the book is just arguing over the term itself and who owns it, because there are challenges. You have those who are self-identifying as evangelicals. You have associations that have called themselves evangelicals and have the points. Of course, David Bebbington, who's coming on the show, talking about his quadrilateral, and even you guys debate the validity of the quadrilateral, which we'll get to in a moment for those that don't know who it is. But let's really get into it, because, and here's why this is your other book, the Rise of Evangelicalism, because you give a basic, and I say that putting all the qualifiers around it, of the starting of American evangelicalism, which I find to be very key and helpful in understanding the tenets of it, especially with Whitefield. So I don't remember the question that I asked you. Well, what's an evangelical, Mark? What's an evangelical?
Well, I made a living for almost 40 years teaching undergraduates and graduate students, and I got to say a lot. It's complicated.
That's what you should. I know you're not a Facebook person, but they have your relationship status. It's complicated. That's evangelical. It should have. It's complicated. But go ahead and describe that. Elaborate.
Let me start with what I think it'd be a simple way of getting at this. The evangelical used as an adjective goes way back to the Middle Ages. Actually, one of the first times that term was used was with the followers of St. Francis. So in the 11th and 12th century, to be an evangelical was to sit very lightly to your possessions, and even perhaps to follow St. Francis and Clare, the female counterpart, to just give your stuff away. Well, and this is of course a simplified history, but in the 16th century, when Protestant leaders, William Tyndale, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Thomas Cranmer in England, said, well, the church has preserved a lot of what's really important, but the machinery of the church has gotten away from understanding the heart of Christianity as it had been communicated by Christ and kept alive by the Holy Spirit. And what was being lost was an understanding of God's free grace, the good news of the gospel, the Evangelion, that offers peace, offers people peace with God, reconciliation with God and with others. And so in the 16th century, the adjective evangelical came to be used on those, the emphasis that stressed God's grace as the key matter for understanding Christianity. So that's an element in Protestant circles, and it's even present a little bit in Catholic circles with our reforming movements of people who say, well, yes, we do need to emphasize more the offer of reconciliation, peace with God, forgiveness of sins by grace. It's a subordinate element in Catholic circles until much later. It's dominant in Protestant circles. But 16th century, 17th century, it's really hard to say, well, Martin Luther's an evangelical, John Calvin's an evangelical, Menno Simons is an evangelical, because the structures were such that these groups either didn't want to have anything to do with each other, or they weren't identified as evangelical. They were identified as Reformed, as Lutheran, as Mennonite, as Anglican. It's not until we get to the 18th century that some of the tendencies that had been present all along are heightened and highlighted, and some of the structures that had given shape to the institutional history of Protestantism begin to weaken. And we get people like George Whitefield, who several times in his career would be challenged. Well, you're a priest in the Church of England. Don't you want to uphold Church of England doctrine? He said, well, you know, if you're a Baptist, if you're a Congregationalist, if you're a Quaker, and you preach the new birth, then I want to be with you. The Wesleys, in their reforming movement within the Church of England, and eventually with the Methodist movement, said, well, church order is important, but what's really, really important are people who understand that it's God's free grace in Christ that brings us salvation. So you get, in the 18th century, the 19th century, the beginning of the movement from evangelical, from an adjective to a noun, although that's a very long process. And I think is what particularly David Bebbington has shown, and what we try to point out in the book you mentioned, it's really not until after World War II that using evangelical as a noun. So what is Billy Graham? Well, people don't say, well, he's a member of a Southern Baptist church. They say Billy Graham is evangelical. It's only after World War II that we get a history writing about evangelicalism as if it's a category, a real life category. Earlier you would say, well, Charles Simeon was an evangelical in the Church of England. Charles Wesley wrote evangelical hymns, but Wesley's a Methodist. Charles Simeon's an Anglican. Charles Finney was a dynamic preacher of revival. There were evangelical elements in his theology. Jonathan Edwards was a great evangelical theologian, but you can't write about all of those people together because they didn't have connections. Whereas, beginning with the National Association of Evangelicals, beginning with the worldwide ministry of Billy Graham, beginning with Christianity Today magazine, you have institutions and researchable facts that are concentrated on what it means to be an evangelical. And then the great contribution of David Bebbington in his book, late 1980s, Evangelicalism in Britain, was to say, well, what are the characteristics of these evangelical movements that now we can call evangelicalism? Well, there's the reliance on the Bible as a chief authority. There's the belief that the cross of Christ is the key thing in reconciliation of God and humans. There's often conversion, although that's a little bit tricky because we get some well-identified evangelicals in the modern world for whom conversion is less important than it is for others. And then there's activism. So Bible, cross, conversion, activism, Bebbington quite clearly showed, were characteristics of movements in the church that, particularly in the last couple of generations, you can define people as. Problems. What about groups like the Lutherans? What about groups like the African American churches? What about in the post-Vatican II era, where you have Catholics who will say, well, my experience of the Holy Spirit was like a conversion, and clear, we follow the church, but we follow the church because the church honors the scriptures. Bebbington is very clear in saying that he is isolating characteristics, not providing a definition. And I actually think on that score, you can say evangelicalism is the conceptual understanding of Christian faith that emphasizes these four things. On the ground, in groups, in historical development, it's much harder to say. You're talking about evangelicalism. I've mentioned already how enjoyable it's been for me to study African-American Christians in the late 18th, 19th, 20th century. And here are groups that are focused on the Bible, believe in conversion, have a very strong place for the cross of Christ, and when it's permitted are quite active in the faith. And you say, well, many of these African-American traditions are clearly evangelical. But if you would say, well, let's try to write a history of evangelicalism that includes the Black churches and the whole panoply of white churches. Well, you can do it. But you can say, well, here's some evangelical emphases. James W.C. Pennington, Frederick Douglass, Charles Hodge from the white Presbyterian, Samuel Schmucker, white Lutheran. But there's no institutional connection between them. They're developing in separate streams. Years and years ago, I did a book on evangelical professional Bible study. And I look back now and say, well, it's an okay book on what I researched, but I didn't have any African Americans. African American approaches to the scriptures are really quite different historically, not 100% different, but quite different historically than the white churches. Can we say we have an evangelical history of the Bible, evangelical history of Bible study, if we exclude African Americans? And then you're interested in, as many people are, quite appropriately, in how Christian faith is spreading in some parts of the world very, very rapidly. Institutions like the World Evangelical Fellowship send Brian Stiller around the world to report on evangelical movements. Sometimes the movements he talks about call themselves evangelical. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes there are things that look pretty strange from these traditional evangelical Presbyterians. Is a lot of health and wealth amongst these prosperity gospel and these. Are they? To what degree is a person still an evangelical when they talk occasionally about prosperity? What degree are they evangelical? They talk a lot. What degree are they evangelical? They talk all the time. Well, it's very hard to put these things together. The general point I think I'd like to make is that evangelicalism conceptually is a pretty clear category. There's styles of Christian faith, particularly in the modern era. You can say, well, that's evangelical. Evangelicalism as a researchable object, institution, substance on the ground is a much harder entity to get your mind around. This is David Bebbington and I have talked about this and really argued about it for a long time, because I say there is no such thing that you can actually research as evangelicalism. There's clearly a concept of what evangelicalism means, but if I'm going to study American evangelicals, I've got to put in there a lot of people who don't have anything to do with each other. So how do I write a history of evangelicalism if there's no one place I can go to research that history? Well, Bebbington says, well, the concept is clear, the characteristics are clear, and you put together the people who share the characteristics. Well, that can work when you kind of grow up thinking, well, evangelical means the National Association of Evangelicals, Moody Bible Institute, Asbury Seminary, Gordon Conwell Seminary. But does it include also the Assemblies of God? Does it include also the African Methodist Episcopal Church? Does it include also the Catholic groups now that want to call themselves evangelical? Well, conceptually, yes. For research, historical purposes, is I think a different answer. I've meandered on an awful long time.
No. What was it that the term that they threw at you? You were a nominalist. Was
right.
that the term?
Yes, I think that when you name evangelicalism, when people say, here are the characteristics, that makes sense. But is evangelicalism something real that you can actually research? And that's where I think it isn't.
Well, is this because you and I both had Wells, and I mean, of course, he wrote the book, The Courage to be Protestant. He was done with the terminology altogether just because it's become, when everybody self-identifies as it's lost its meaning. And we both know that terms may have a meaning at one time, but words in history are fluid. So I think of what C.S. Lewis said when he talked about words are like a stream. They change over time. They meander back and forth. Like the word scan. Now we just means like to glance over, but that's not how it was historically. It was like examine intently. And so we've come to this point where, are we at this turning point where evangelicalism or evangelical is just lost? And do we try to adopt a new term? Like personally, I think of what Bonhoeffer did in World War II, where it was like, we're the confessing church. Yeah. And again, you're just subsplintering, and then that itself will become historically, if I'm any type of term that we employ is going to lose its meaning from its original intent at some point in time, right, as it goes on. And unless you're Roman Catholic or Orthodox, and even then, I mean, you've got a set of beliefs that are institutionalized, right, that can adhere to. But when it's a free association of self-identification, that becomes a big issue.
Exactly. So we take the term evangelical. In the early 1940s, there were white fundamentalists, primarily in the Northeast, Midwest, West Coast, who said, we want to keep a lot of what the fundamentalists were defending, but we want also to re-engage the culture. We want to put a new stress on how learning, when carried out properly, can help us. We want to engage with the broader Christian world and the broader world of academia. So let's find a term that lets us keep what was really important in fundamentalism, but it can broaden things out. And well, let's call it evangelical. So we get the National Association of Evangelical. But then right away, well, what about the Assemblies of God? What about these Pentecostals? When Pentecostalism became a phenomenon in America in the early 20th century, oh boy, most Arminian groups, Methodists, Nazarenes, Reformed, said that this is an aberration. If this is Christianity, it's a very skewed form of Christianity. But there were, by the 1930s and 40s, leaders of the Assemblies of God who looked like faithful Christians, talked like faithful Christians, acted like faithful Protestant Christians. So the leaders of the NAE said, well, are they interested? And they were interested. And so we have, right from the start, major contribution to the National Association of Evangelical is the Assemblies of God, and then eventually other Pentecostal groups. So a word was being used more broadly than it had been earlier in the century. And then right away also, what about the Missouri Synod Lutherans? These people, above everybody else, believes in grace, salvation by grace through faith, but they also believe that baptism communicates the new birth. And when they take communion, they think Christ is there. Now, should they? Well, so they sort of were in and sort of were not. So the word was flexible from the beginning. And then more recently, we have the really obvious question: what about African American groups? They share the characteristics. We got a really nice essay for the book you mentioned by Jamar Tisby, a Black scholar, activist, asking the question, should African Americans be considered evangelicals? And in the book, at least, he says, of course they should, because they have these kind of characteristics. But the National Association of Evangelical Leaders really they weren't alert to that question. So it wasn't until at least the 60s and then the 70s, Billy Graham began to reach out in some intentional ways to Black communities. There was other sorts of interchange, but until the government moved to desegregate society, the idea that you could have a single institution, regardless of what you call it, in which there was a longstanding white Christian Protestant tradition and a longstanding Black Christian Protestant tradition considered as one thing, it's just an impossible notion. But more recently, the question becomes alive. And then even more recently, in the United States, where we've got the politicization of the evangelical world, you've got to say, well, gosh, I'm this kind of Christian. I believe in the authority of the Bible. I think it's important people to be converted to Christ. The cross of Christ is important. Need to be active in sharing the faith and showing. But I don't want to get involved in the political disputes. I don't want to say to someone who voted for Trump or voted against Trump, you are my brother, you are my ally. I want to keep people defining their religious character on religious question, but
not a political one.
But in the contemporary world, when so many of the voices in the public sphere and then some voices in the religious sphere are defining evangelical by their political stance, then you've got, in your metaphor, a wonderful metaphor, you've got the river moving on, and the word that had denoted certain things in the past, for at least many people, does not denote the same thing. And then we have the world situation. What are we going to say about the Chinese house churches, where conversion is important, authority of the Bible is important, cross of Christ is important, Christian active, and who, if they know about the American situation, it just doesn't register at all. Are these people evangelical? Are they not evangelical? Are they non-American evangelical? So you can start stringing together adjectives, but of course then you lose the coherence of a single term.
Well, even as you're talking about African Americans, whether or not they're considered to be evangelical according to the definitions that have been chosen, and again, I defined as, let's say, the National Association of Evangelicals according to the criteria in which they've established, although of course we would both agree that, or at least I would think so, that that's just one particular manifestation of that. But then you think in other terms, like for example, we had Sam George on, and Sam is of Lausanne and diaspora, and we're talking about immigrant Christianities in the plural here in the United States. I mean, we haven't talked about the Latino church. We haven't talked about the Indian church or Chinese or Asian and the many different incarnations of that itself. And so there are many different, and so we're struggling for those definitions. But then you have something come along like Lausanne. And Lausanne does try to give an overarching umbrella as a clarification. Help our listeners understand what Lausanne is. I know that's not necessarily your field of expertise, but I'm sure you can speak into it. And what has that done for the understanding of what evangelical is, being an evangelical is?
Well, yes, the Lausanne movement really is important. It's referring to the 1974 meeting in Lausanne, Switzerland, called together I was going to say primarily, but certainly as a major factor, by the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, the Congress on World Evangelization, which among its other activities produced a Lausanne Covenant. So it's a kind of statement of faith. Actually, a very important gathering together of people who emphasized evangelical characteristics, as George Marsden famously defined evangelical once. Well, evangelical is somebody who likes Billy Graham. So this is.
Did he write that in Religion and American Culture? Is that the book?
I think he might have written it in the chapter. We have a excerpt in the book you mentioned from something he wrote. I think in the.
I remember the Billy Graham part because I laughed just because of I think that's really true.
But what came at Lausanne was an effort spearheaded by John Stott and then a few other colleagues to pull together a doctrinal statement, a covenant that would speak very broadly for those around the world who were concerned actively about evangelism. And there were many denominations represented. There were more nations represented at Lausanne than at the United Nations. The Lausanne Covenant is what I would call a kind of classical Protestant understanding of religious authority, Scripture, the way of salvation focused on grace in Christ. The innovation that people have focused upon, particularly in recent historical studies, is that there was a clear statement in the Lausanne Covenant that the gospel was designed for reconciling people to God and reconciling people to each other on earth. So it wasn't a social gospel, but there's a very clear social implication of Christian faith spelled out in the Lausanne Covenant in a way that had been at the least de-emphasized, and in some cases disregarded or even opposed in traditions that we might call Western or at least American evangelical history. So the Lausanne Covenant has actually worked very well around the world for some groups, not maybe a huge number, but some groups who would say, we want to associate the work of God that we see in our place with other things around the world. And the Lausanne Covenant has been a way to do that, because it's not overly specific on things like the sacraments that divide evangelical people. Mm-hmm. It's not detailed on explaining how the Christian gospel can be worked out in this life, but it says definitely that it should be worked out in this life. And so it served very important. Years ago, did a textbook on world Christianity called Turning Points. Mm-hmm. And I've actually been delighted to find two younger historians, David Comline and Han Luen Concert Comline, who recently revised the book. But in later editions of the book, I tried to specify the Lausanne meeting and the Second Vatican Council as the two key events in the latter part of the 20th century that people can look back on as key turning points. For institutional Catholicism, it meant huge changes that are still being discussed and implemented. But then for the Protestant world, it represented an alternative to the institutional developments of the World Council of Churches, where there were all sorts of elements, some that evangelical would say would be fine and really helpful, and some that evangelical would say would be really distorting the Christian gospel. So those, whether or not, and people in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years will look back and say, well, those really were the key moments. Certainly from our perspective in the early 21st century, what Lausanne represented is a real good faith effort supported by a wide, not a universal, but a wide spectrum of people that would be relatively traditional, relatively confessional, relatively evangelistic in their outlook. It represented a way of coalescing, bringing together, at least temporarily, at least on the basis of the covenant, what was very, very disparate. Using the term evangelical as a characteristic, evangelical groups tend not to be institutional builders in the same way that formal denominations are. And so the Lausanne Covenant was a really important signpost that many of these groups that look like they're just harem-scarum and scattered and independent do actually have a center, do have some coherence. And so it really, I think, remains a very important event in late 20th century American Christian history, and not just Protestant history. But, and you've got a lot more experience in a lot more churches than I have, I'm pretty much convinced that if the ordinary pastor in an ordinary evangelical church said, now today we're going to examine how important the Lausanne Covenant is, 95% of the audience and the congregation say, well, the what? What are we talking about here? I've never heard of this Lausanne Covenant. And that would be a problem where what people like myself, whose job it is to sit in a library and read things, would know about a very important event, a very important document, but the dissemination of information explaining why that was important just hasn't gone too far. Would I be wrong in concluding?
No, I think you're entirely right. But I also think that's one of the reasons why we exist, is not that we're out there trying to explain Lausanne, but I think Lausanne gives an umbrella for global evangelicalism, in which it makes a big tent. And I also like their theme, the whole gospel to the whole world. And I think that modern contemporary American white evangelicals have isolated the gospel to one small aspect of what the gospel really is. And I think that Lausanne broadens that and shows how big it really actually is. And it really does try to bring in other voices that I think strengthens the church in our view of God and our understanding of God. And it also joins us to a greater movement that's not just culturally tied to one moment or one specific ethnic group or region, but enables people to show the reality of the gospel in their specific sphere of influence, and how the gospel is impacting that people, place, group, culture, whatever you want to use as a definer there. And I think that's a sad thing, really. I think in our current cultural moment, as you mentioned, with the fragmentation of evangelicalism or the politicization of it that it's gone on, and how it's been co-opted by the media or even defined itself, like it's been in some ways stolen from those who would be the adherents of it and redefined in a way that I think some would agree to, while others would pull back from, because of the political characterization in which it's gone and the figures in which it's been associated with, and how it's been culturally manipulated or used. Just as it was mentioned in the book, and I can't remember what chapter it was, where they looked at the Southern strategy by Republicans in order to manipulate the evangelical group in order to get it to vote for certain causes. That brings a set of repulsion to me as an individual. And it made me stop and go, I don't want to be defined that way. I mean, I think anyone has a hard time being defined by an outward group in a negative way. But I do think that it made me pause and go, okay, what does it mean? Can we rescue the term? And because to me, that's one of the biggest issues that we have right now, is we're talking about this identification. I mean, even if you go on Twitter, it's all arguing over terms and words and verbiages and labels and everything else. That's the world in which we're living in. It's these battles over, I mean, pronouns is what we're battling over, and self-identity. Can I choose to identify in this way and identify that way? And even when we're looking at history, in some ways, we are labeling and identifying what that is, but we have the opportunity or the advantage of labeling something that's not fighting back in that it's dead, it's gone. We can label it and call it whatever, in some ways, what we want it to be. And those are the historians that do that. So we're in this lived moment. That's also mentioned in here, that Christianity or evangelicalism is a lived religion. Elaborate. I know that's not a chapter that you wrote in this book, but I think it's imperative and important for us to understand, what does it mean to be a lived faith in this moment when it comes to understanding or self-identifying under this term of evangelicalism?
Yes, I mean, the lived component would relate to very strong historical precedents where people who are known for defining themselves in relationship to God's free grace in Christ have, in many instances, taken certain actions in society and in organization of their families and approaching to life in the world that carry on the meaning, extend the meaning of reconciliation between individuals and God to reconciliation among individuals on the earth. And I mean, that way of framing things means, well, we're back to the Franciscans in the Middle Ages, because they were known as evangelicals partly for what they believed, but more for how they acted. And when you come to the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther is a fountainhead of what are later considered to be essential evangelical traits. But you wouldn't want to follow Martin Luther in how he late in his life began to attack the Jews. I mean, from his angle, he was following through consistently. From my angle, that was a gross deviation. But when Martin Luther writes to his barber and to lay we're struggling with things that have happened in their lives, and he offers them a scriptural account of how Christ stands with the brokenhearted. Christ is with those who have suffered great trauma. Then you say, well, there, from my perspective, is evangelical action that comports with the evangelical belief in how people are reconciled to God. You come into later history, and again, you just have to emphasize the complexity of things, even though it takes time to explain. George Whitefield is an evangelical and insisting upon the new birth is a key matter. And then in the generation after Whitefield, there'll be a few people who take that very seriously and say, well, if we're talking about God's valuation of people such that Christ died that they could be born again, don't we want to follow through and say that the human dignity implied really speaks against the enslavement of Black Africans? And so there is, by the end of the 18th century, some evangelical, joined by some Quakers who aren't real evangelical, a kind of active anti-slavery. But, and here you just gotta talk about the complexity. George Whitefield himself is empathetic to people in enslavement, but also is a defender eventually of the slave system in the American colonies. So is George Whitefield an evangelical? Well, clearly he is in emphasizing the new birth, but in Lausanne Covenant terms, when Whitefield turns from being sympathetic to enslaved people and chastising slave owners for mistreatment of their enslaved people, while he defends the slave system, you'd say that's not very evangelical. The action is not comporting with the doctrine. Now, that of course is my reading of the historical situation. There would be others right through the 19th century, and you can even find a few today, Bible believers who would say, well, if you read the Bible very carefully, you can see that the scriptures really do not rule out slavery as a system of organizing labor. That was a very common conclusion, North as well as South, among white people through the Civil War, and it continues to be a conclusion. There were people at the time who pointed out, well, whatever the Bible has to say about slavery, it's always white people doing it to white people, or Caucasians doing it to Caucasians. And here we're talking about a slave system set up that enslaves only African. Can that be approved by? Well, then there's huge debate. So the debates were coming out of the impulse that you were talking about. If you have an evangelical understanding of God's free grace in Christ given to unworthy sinners, you're saying something really definite about the value of unworthy sinners. All human unworthy sinners. And if you believe in that kind of value, God-given image of God, possibility to be redeemed in all humanity, how can you undermine that sense by practicing a form of racially specific slavery in which many of the very express commands of the Bible about paying laborers, whether they're hired, so on and so forth. Well, so it's a debate. You can see it's debate, but your sense that evangelical has to mean something in practice is why people who agreed on the evangelical character of the belief argued so much about and had such really bitter battles as to what it means to live as a faithful Christian. And in the 20th century, we have the same thing. Early part of the 20th century, historians talk blithely, quickly about the fundamentalist modernist controversy. It's really never that simple, but a fundamentalist would be characterized as someone who thinks the great sins in life are drunkenness, wasting your time on worldly entertainments. Whereas other branches of Protestant Christianity, Catholic Christianity would say the great evils of life are when you run a business and keep pushing down, lowering wages for your workers, or you allow cities to develop with no concern for how women are being mistreated and non-whites are being mistreated. Well, that's a modernist way of trying to put Christianity to use, so-called, and a fundamentalist so-called way of trying to put Christianity to use. But they're both coming out of the sense that if you have a belief in how God reconciles people to himself, then you've got to have a practice. I think one of the really great contributions of historical scholarship in America is to see how clearly evangelical in their traditions were the modernists, because they were the people who were taking action on things like urban development, economic life, following right in the tradition of people like Charles Grandison Finney, who said, well, slavery is terrible. And of course, the fundamentalists are coming right out of the evangelical tradition in what they emphasize. So the debates in Christian circles are often about beliefs, and those are, of course, very important debates. But almost always also those arguments about belief come along with arguments about what it means to put the faith into practice. Evangelical traditions are traditions that see the necessity of living out in the world according to the principles, standards, guidance, models found in the belief. Now, they're not the only Christian groups to do that, but that activism is just essential. But activism to what end? To what goals? By what standards? By what protocols? Those are always matters for debate.
Because of the complexity of it, and we've seen the shift now where it's become much more of a political terminology. How is that? Actually, let's focus on that for a moment. How did it become so politicized?
Well, there are different ways of looking at the history, but what I've concluded is that the civil rights movement was the necessary precondition for this politicization in this way. Before the civil rights movement and then the legislation in the mid-1960s and the Supreme Court decisions earlier, white evangelicals in the North were Republican overwhelmingly. White evangelicals in the South were even more overwhelmingly Democratic. Once the civil rights legislation and judicial decisions take place, segregation is ended. And eventually, most white evangelicals say that that's a good thing. There's resistance in the early stages and some that continues, but not too much. But once you have the division in the American white evangelical population removed, segregation, then it's possible to have a national white evangelical mindset. So it's not at all surprising to me that within a generation of the ending of governmentally approved segregation, you have, as you referenced already, some Republican leaders in the era of Ronald Reagan saying, can we mobilize white evangelical constituency for Ronald Reagan. And there are white evangelical leaders from around the country who are getting active in a historically evangelical way in saying, if we believe the gospel, we have to believe certain things about how life in the world is to be carried out. And you have some very, very famous instances of people like Jerry Falwell, who early in his preaching career says, we don't want to be involved in politics. We want to focus upon the promise of the second coming. But then lo and behold, by the late 1960s, 1970s, it's really important that if you believe in the gospel, you have to get involved in politics in this way. Well, you really can't have a national movement energized by such ideas if you've got a stark political division between white evangelicals who support the Democrats, white evangelicals who support the Republicans. But after the ending of segregation, then Republicans make gains in the South. There is this opportunity for a national movement, and you get what is a white national political constituency that eventually will be the most reliable constituency for the Republican Party. And now here comes more complexity. At the same time, over the same period of years, the most consistent American constituency for the Democratic Party are African Americans. And among the African Americans that make up that most Democratic constituency is a huge number of African Americans who, on religious characteristic terms, are evangelical. So the two groups in modern, recent American political constituencies that are most clearly identified with the political party are both evangelical groups. One black for the Democrats, one white for the Republicans. And that's why, if you keep these race constituencies in mind, it seems to me why the precipitation of what you've just described begins with the national civil rights activities of the 1960s.
Knowing that what evangelicalism has become in the United States, as you've already examined in these two political spheres, how do we juxtapose that with what evangelical is in the global sphere?
You can't.
We have to solve these problems on this show.
No, we can't. We're not going to do it. That's a great question, and the more awareness there is about the spread of the Christian faith in all its forms around the world, and the more awareness there is of crucial Christian developments in North America, with the coming of, so to speak, world Christianity into particularly American cities, but then American life in general, the more things get complicated.
Complicated or clarified? Complicated or clarified?
Well, just complicated. Because I mean, what does get clarified is that there are Protestant movements and a few Catholic movements clearly showing the evangelical characteristics, who aren't divided and can't be described in American political terms. So Hispanic evangelicals in the United States, of which there's a growing number, do tend to lean that they're actually more Republican in their political outcome than say Black evangelical groups, but they're divided. There's just nothing like the white evangelical Republican constituency. When you talk about his, I mean, there are very strong Hispanic evangelical Republicans, but there's very strong Hispanic evangelical Democrats in a way that is just not, you don't see it in it. The same thing with Asian American Christian believers. Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean,
Indian. Yeah.
right, West Indies, Jamaican, African.
Mhm.
These are all groups that have in America strong and growing churches. They're mostly evangelical by the doctrinal characteristics, but either are uninvolved or not involved as much in the political division. So again, there's a conundrum. Is there a word to talk about these people? And I don't think there is a word. You can say evangelical, but then you've got to say something like evangelicalism religiously defined, as opposed to politically defined, or people with traditional Protestant beliefs about doctrine and culture. Well, that's hopeless, because you can't have a phrase when you're on the internet. You have to have one word. It's got to be punchy. So the world situation, both outside the United States and then as the world comes into the United States, is not entirely, but mostly unconnected to the political story in the United States. And that is actually just a very important point to grasp for Christian reasons, but obviously for cultural and political understanding as well.
The question that I think most of my listeners are asking themselves is this: oh, wait, is it okay to call myself an evangelical? What do you say to that?
Well, if you're in a conversation and you're able to explain what you mean, sure. But if you're, on the 5 o'clock news and you got 30 seconds to make a point about something else, you can't take 28 seconds to say, well, here's the kind of evangelical I am, here's the kind of evangelical I'm not. And let me now answer your question, but then you'll be off to the football scores or something like that. So I mean, evangelical seems to me still to be a really good word, but increasingly it becomes difficult to use it just because of what connotations are held. We have a short essay in the book you mentioned by Tommy Kidd, really fine historian at Baylor, who does get pulled into these debates. And I sympathize with Tommy, because I think of myself as my day job is really American history of 18th and 19th century. And then you get asked to talk about these modern things, and Tommy's the same way, but he has made a really strong effort in articles and a fine book from Yale University Press to say, well, yes, these other things are important, but evangelical really should be defined in religious terms and in history of the religious use of the term. It's, to me, a very sound argument, but it might be an argument that, he's got 15,000 people reading his book and one broadcast on the evening, 10 broadcasts, because there's all sorts of different things. We'll have, 1.5 million viewers. So I'm not really optimistic about the future of the word evangelical in American public discourse. I think for world purposes, for if you're given a chance to talk about what you mean, for the development of so much of church life in North America, I think I've heard from a number of sources that the only evangelical type or evangelical churches that are growing rapidly in Canada are from world constituencies. Many of the evangelical type and evangelical churches in the United States that are flourishing can be characterized in the same way. So if you're in a situation where you're able to explain how you're using the term evangelical, primarily thinking about religious emphases or religious tradition, it's a word that's going to work fine. But in a cultural situation where the political snap uses of the word are predominating, then that's a very different story.
What then do you think are the biggest threats, not just to evangelicalism, but Christianity as a whole in our contemporary society? As we said at the beginning, history is cyclical. There's always the pendulum shift from one to the other. And as you mentioned earlier, it was an insight into understanding human behavior and human culture and civilization. Knowing what you know and seeing the patterns in history, what do you think the biggest threats are today?
Well, I think I would say, and this would be a kind of theological analysis, but one really based on a lot of historical explanation, is that the threats are what they've always been, and that is for people who know or the gospel message to overlay that message with a lot of other things, such that the gospel message is not clear. And I say historically, I've spent a lot of time looking at Christian publications and Christian institutional activities during the American Revolution, during the American Civil War, the lead up to the Civil War. And in those instances, there were people who were, they wouldn't have used the term themselves, but we can. They were evangelical Christians who said, if you believe that we should still follow the Parliament, I can have no association with you. If you believe that it's necessary to support the Union as if it were God's instrument, it's important to support the Confederacy if it's God's instrument. It's the same mistake. It's having other loyalties supersede what in Christian terms should be the foundational loyalty. And that actually, it's easy to make a judgment about the people you disagree with. You think that a political position is more important than the Christian faith. You say you're a Christian, but you really, well, but it's, as you know, the parable of Jesus, you know, if you can see that in somebody else, it probably means you've got something in your life that you're evaluating, putting more highly than your understanding of the Christian faith. It might be the opposite political position. It might be something, you know, all sorts of temptations. So I don't think there's anything new in threats to the solidity of Christian faith. But what is new is the character of threats to the Christian faith. The basic threat is always subordinating the clarity of the gospel with other things, other stuff, and other stuff can be almost anything. And in our day, it happens to be a lot of political loyalties.
That leads me to another question, and this is probably even bigger than you as a historian. The question that yes, you said that other loyalties supersede the clarification or the clarity of the gospel message itself. What do you do though when the message of the gospel becomes, it has other things attached to it? Because then the question is what is the gospel? It gets down to the very essence of the gospel itself. Maybe that's not a question for us today, but it's a big question, because even how as you guys define it in the book, I don't want to say that the gospel is defined by the culture in which it finds itself. The gospel is, but different implications of the gospel become much more influential or impacting debating on what's going on at that moment. Just to me, like, orthodoxy is orthodoxy, but orthodoxy is most often articulated when it encounters heterodoxy. Just like with the gospel itself, Jesus Christ came in the flesh. He literally was born. He lived a sinless life. He died, substitutionary atonement. I mean, even that gets into different parts of it. But then the resurrection of the dead, and you mentioned this in the book where you got into, and I can't remember if it was this book or the other book, where you got into, they were focusing on the incarnation and not the crucifixion or the resurrection. There was an aspect of that part, but to me, I was like, they're bookends. Of course, they're bookends. You need both, but the emphasis depends upon what's going on in that cultural moment. Because even in the Gospels itself, I mean, you have Jesus referred to his birth in Matthew, but Luke doesn't mention a thing about it, so he didn't find it relevant for his audience. Not that it's not; it is. There's a reason why we have the four Gospels. Sorry, I'm just geeking out there.
I think what has helped me in answering questions like that are the really terrific works of missiological history and theory of the last 30 years. So
yay!
I've told people that at one stage of my life, I avoided a midlife crisis by finding out how interesting Canadian history was. And then a little bit later, I had discovered Andrew Walls and Laman Sana and Dana Robert, and they allowed me to miss another midlife crisis. 'Cause I think what is so trenchant, so perceptive with Andrew. I mean, it's a lot of people now, but I first got it from Walls and Sana and Dana Robert, was that the Christian gospel never comes without culture.
Yes.
It's always enculturated. So the life, death, resurrection of Christ is very specific in Jewish culture under Roman Empire of the first century. Okay. So that means just the notion that there's a kind of culture-free Christianity that drops on different cultures just doesn't work. But then the missiologists go on to say, and this is particularly strong in essays that I read first in Andrew Walls, that the character of the Christian faith means that it is at home in any culture. So if you're think what is the weirdest kind of social cultural setting you know, and then the one you're in, which of course is the normal, ordinary, right one. The Christian faith is always enculturated, and it always can speak to in any culture. And the Christian faith always calls people in every culture to repent of their sin, to recognize the need for forgiveness and improvement. So in a way that I think is just mind-blowing, when you try to wrap your mind around it, Christianity solves the wrong word. Christianity exemplifies how the one and the many can get along with each other. There's one incarnation. It's always in culture when it appears again, but it ties together potentially those who are from this. You get the wonderful passages in the book of Revelation about people from every tribe, nation, and tongue. And you think, well, gosh, if you stop to think about that, when in human history have people from every tribe, tongue, and nation actually gotten along with each other? Not even speaking about singing together or praising one thing together, but just kind of not killing each other. Well, there's the genius of Christianity. But it's not a Christianity that floats above and calls people up. It's a Christianity that enters in and gathers in the world culture. So, I've only been reading these missiologists for 25 years, and I think it's going to take actually centuries to incorporate what are the really strong commitments to human life as it's lived. The no pie in the sky Christianity, the really strong commitment, because the life of Christ was deeply, infinitely committed to human existence. But then also to see that cultural specificity goes along with the universality of grace in all cultures. And I mean, that is what it has done for me is to make me no longer feeling guilty about really prizing the things that have spoken most clearly and powerfully to me in my culture, and at the same time moving toward trying to respect and understand and have empathy for how the Christian faith has spoken so deeply, as profoundly, as clearly to other people in other cultural situations. I call it a missiological understanding, but that to me is both given confidence in going further in what I think are the Christianity's expression where I live, but also gaining respect for Christianity's transformations where other people live. Culture, in other words, culture needs a lot of reflection by people interested in Christian faith, and I think that's one of the deficits of the, broadly speaking, evangelical tradition, that has been much stronger in action than in thinking about action. You don't want to go completely in the other direction and think so much you're not acting, but thinking about how the gospel is always enculturated, always at home, but then always also calling people to transform where they live.
Well, that's
thinking needs to go forward.
That's why we talk about missiology is really what we're about. How's the mission of God worked out? Andrew Walls has been a huge influence, as has you said it differently. I said Laman Sane. How do you say it?
Laman Sane.
Sane.
Yeah.
I never got his name. Whose Religion is Christianity? I remember that book very well, and especially Walls, the cross-cultural process in Christian history, and his stuff is just phenomenal. And I know he's with Jesus now, but I think is instrumental in understanding the future of Christianity and where it's headed, because that enculturation aspect, that understanding of culture is shifting with globalization, but individual expressions as they encounter globalization and what that they have as the deep structures of thought, as James Davison Hunter talks about, is I mean, we're going way deep right now, everybody, but it's where those psychological and the way that we understand ourselves in the middle of the world, how we have been taught to understand ourselves, how we think, how we express, because Christianity always has to, as you said, and Walls has said, it always has to be enculturated. But the question is what does it affirm about that culture that it can build a bridge to? And what does it challenge about that culture that has as its idols? And we have our own idols that have developed in our own culture and have spread across the world with globalization, with YouTube, with the internet, all of those different fabrics of it. But that brings me back to another part of something that I think you have drawn upon that I wanted to explore a little bit. You mentioned, and you've written about it, the scandal of the evangelical mind. And you were writing it in one, as you mentioned, there are turning points, but there are also cultural moments on why those books are necessary that may not always be needed outside of that time. And what I mean by that is you're addressing an issue that you saw. And my question is that issue, I mean, we're 20 some years away from that book now. Is that issue as relevant as you look? Let me ask a couple of questions. Number one, why did you write the book? Number two, what was the cultural thing that you felt like you needed to address? And number three, has the cultural milieu shifted where that book is still necessary?
Yeah, I know those are excellent questions. And actually, those are more or less what I've tried to address in the preface and the new preface and the new afterword to a reprinting that Eerdmans did of the scandal of the evangelical mind. So the research for the original book was the late 80s or early 1990s. And it was at a time when debates among evangelicals and fundamentalists tended to be focused on how you interpret the scriptures. So what should be the attitude of Christ honoring, God fearing, Bible reading people toward modern science? I used evolution as a prime example. How should these same people be thinking about and acting in the political landscape of the late 20th century? And the burden of that book was to say that there were some really fine, important qualities of fundamentalism that should be carried on, but there were some that should be dispensed with. And I've focused on ways of reading the Bible that took the Bible out of its context and kind of put it together like a late 19th century jigsaw puzzle. One of the examples was the first Iraq War, which led to a huge evangelical market for books on the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. So reading Revelation, and Saddam Hussein was going to be so and so, and you know so those habits of mind, I thought, were getting in the way of what would be proper Christian approach to life and study in the world. Not, of course, accepting everything that was conventional in the American intellectual life, but approaching these matters with discrimination and with clarity. Now, things have changed. The threat to clear thinking about Christianity in relation to culture, to the life of the mind, I think comes from the politicization more we've been talking about. At least as I'm aware, and broadly speaking in evangelical circles, there's not nearly so much debate today as to what biblical inerrancy means for your approaches to science, your understanding of the book of Genesis, the book of Revelation, as there was then. In my view, that's not a bad situation, because that earlier focus was much of what I was complaining about in writing The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. What hasn't changed is that there's a sense that the Christian faith's implication for intellectual life needs to be developed from the inside the Christian faith itself. After writing The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, I worked what was supposed to be a year or two later on another book, Jesus Christ and the Life of the Mind. It took probably 15 or 20 years to finish. But the argument of that book was that when you're worried about, as a Christian, problems in science, social sciences, literary theory, you have to be listening to what smart people are saying in the world, but it's even more important to be grounded in the truths of the Christian faith. What does it mean for God to become incarnate? What does it mean for hope for the world to come from the incarnate God being killed and rise from the dead? So the external circumstances have changed somewhat, but the internal dynamic of what the kind of Christian thinking the church always needs and the world always needs, that remains the same. And it's going deep into the Christian faith itself to have your parameters when you are faced with a secular intellectual world, which has all sorts of ideas. The instinct is to say, well, I just know that this is a bad idea. I just know that's a good idea. And my appeal is, well, just avoid the instinct. Try to think through things. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. Sometimes the children of man are more alert than the people in the kingdom. What in modern literary theory from a Christian standpoint can be accepted? What needs to be rejected? What in modern understandings of science should be respected? But it needs a thought process of considering these matters rather than an instinct and a reaction. So I think that situation is the same. And so I was actually pleased that editors at Eerdmans thought it'd be in a different situation, worthwhile republishing the book, adding new introductory and concluding material, but trying to say that the same kind of problem can arise in any circumstance where a Christian community is thinking about the world not from a foundation of Christian faith, but simply reacting to what's out there in the broader public.
How then do we, and this is a loaded question, how do we then grow the life of the mind as a Christian in a world that's bombarded with so many theories that it seems almost impossible to sift them?
That seems to me that's the prime question, or no, not the prime question. It's certainly a very important question that all places training Christian workers should be
asking themselves.
If you're interested in, if you think the Lord has called you to be a pastor, I think in this day and age, one of the proper demands is to just counsel your congregation to not do the ready, fire, aim approach to problems. A pastor can't pontificate on all sorts of matters, but a pastor can say, well, in this congregation, we have people concerned about issue X, Y, or Z. How can we think carefully, clearly? What would be the voices? And thankfully, in many Christian congregations, you'd have people who say, well, let's turn to so-and-so who's expert in such and such. Let's hear what they have to say, not necessarily to follow them, but to become engaged. Now, you put your finger, I think, on a real problem, and that is that there's all sorts of experts in the internet that it's hard sometimes to discriminate. And I think that's a real problem. And I don't know if I have an answer. You want to listen to worthy voices exploring problems and solutions, but isolating those, identifying those worthy voices is a tricky matter.
Well, you guys mentioned that in this book too, because you talk about how Paula White and a lot of the folks at TBN are qualified as evangelicals, but you're not having the streams of Wheaton
Right.
and TBN interlock, and they're not. They're very, very different.
Right. Yeah, I'd like people to be talking to Kevin Van Hooser, Rick Lentz, David Wells,
Yeah.
Oz Guinness,
Same here.
BB in the pro, James Hunter, NT Wright, but these folks, they want to say on the one hand this and the other hand that, and those are kind of that way of approaching problems. Doesn't work.
Well, it's that populist understanding where there's not a nuance or an understanding of history or theological nuance. It's in some ways giving people what they want to hear and clearly defined ways that they can articulate and grab a hold of it. But that's where you're saying, oh, it's the loss of the evangelical mind. People aren't thinking these things through, and all that it implies. But we're out of time for today. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show, and I really appreciated the discussion. Any concluding thoughts that you have for our listeners as we're talking about evangelicalism?
Well, I think the lesson I've learned from my friend David Livingston, the really fine historian of science in Belfast, is if you're a historian, you're probably going to be pessimistic and really down Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturdays. Tuesday, Thursday, try to see a little hope, and on Sunday, pull yourself together. So I think there's just a lot of things to be worried about, to be concerned about, to be really actually frustrated and disappointed about. But Christian faith is something that goes deep and has a foundation for hope as well as for discerning of problems.
Amen and amen. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.